For 6 years, Fritz Haarmann used his position as a police informant to hide his terrible crimes. He committed at least 24 murders and became known as the Vampire of Hanover. In the 1920s, Fritz Haarmann was known as a successful salesman for used clothes and cheap meat. He was loved by all the housewives until they found out that he killed and butchered the bodies of runaway boys. The inhabitants of Hanover, the city where Haarmann was born, considered him an eccentric, however, friendly and harmless. He was liked even by the police, who hired him as an informant. They could not even think that he was capable of terrible murders committed right under their noses. Haarmann was born in 1879 to a man who was known as Gloomy Ole. His mother was disabled, and she adored her youngest son. There were 6 children in the family. Haarmann liked to play with dolls and wear dresses. He avoided other children, especially boys. Wanting to make a real man out of Fritz, Ole sent him to a military school in Breisach when he was 16 years old. The young man liked it there, but after only a few months of training he was diagnosed with epilepsy. Dismissed for health reasons, he worked for a year in his father's cigar factory before committing his first crime, raping underage boys. The police caught him and placed him in a psychiatric hospital. 6 months later, he managed to escape from the hospital and cross the Swiss border. In 1901, Haarmann was hospitalized for 4 months due to epilepsy and a possible mental disorder. In 1902, he was discharged from the army. After Haarmann was discharged, the father repeatedly tried to send his son back to the lunatic asylum, but Fritz managed to avoid this every time. After his discharge from the army, Haarmann began to receive an allowance, which increased in 1904 when he was finally recognized as disabled. For the next decade, he lived on money that he obtained through petty crime and burglary, as well as fraud. Haarmann's first murder. By 1913, the police were fed up with Haarmann's incessant crimes. Convicted of robbing a Hanover warehouse, he ended up in prison for 5 years, where he successfully waited out the First World War. In prison, Haarmann met the 24-year-old pimp Hans Grantz, with whom he fell in love. After their release, they began to live together. In 1918, when the German Empire was collapsing before our eyes, Haarmann was released on parole, and he immediately joined a gang of smugglers and at the same time became a police informant, which will play a huge role in his future plans. In September 1918, 17-year-old Friedel Roh fled his home, hiding in the backyards of Hanover. When Roh's father went in search of his son, he learned that Friedel became friends with Haarmann, who often brought the young men to his house to have a little fun. And yet, when Roh's father informed the authorities of this important detail, they decided not to interfere in the affairs of their most valuable spy. However, the man insisted on his request, and in the end, they decided to pay a visit to Haarmann. Arriving at his home, they found him in bed with a 13-year-old boy. Friedel was nowhere to be seen. All they could do under the laws of the time was to arrest Haarmann for indecent behavior. The police did not conduct a thorough search, but all they had to do was look behind the stove, where the severed head of Friedel Roh was hidden. Haarmann was well known as a black market butcher. Locals loved him for his friendly attitude and incredibly cheap meat. In 1919, Germany was in a difficult economic situation, and many families could hardly feed themselves. In the early 1920s, Haarmann spent much of his time loitering around the Hanover railway station looking for teenagers to lure them to his home with promises of food and comfort. Thousands of children ran away from their parents at that time due to post-war difficulties, so the choice of victims was great. After feeding his victims, Haarmann killed them by injuring the trachea with a love bite. After that, he abused their dead bodies. In the end, he dismembered them, ground them into minced meat or cut them into pieces, selling them under the guise of beef or pork. For 6 years, the police turned a blind eye to the activities of their favorite informant. During this time, Haarmann is believed to have killed over 50 boys. Hans chose them personally according to the item of clothing he liked. Haarmann was successful in selling their clothes and flesh, even as more and more parents flocked to the city, pursued by the vampire of Hanover, in a desperate attempt to find their missing children. In May 1924, the police were forced to turn their attention to Haarmann after children found a skull on the banks of the River Leine. When more skulls and skeletons were pulled out of the water, they decided to explore the Leine River, finding the bodies of at least 22 teenagers. The city of Hanover panicked, and suspicion immediately fell on Haarmann, as everyone knew that he often brought runaway boys to his apartment. Because he was a favorite informant, the Hanoverian police were removed from the investigation. Thus, 2 detectives from Berlin arrived on the scene. Berlin detectives soon found Haarmann in a dark corner of the station, where he attacked a teenager. They threw him in jail, and they themselves went to search the apartment, this time much more thorough. Once behind bars, the vampire from Hanover happily confessed to his crimes. When asked about the number of victims killed, he replied, 30 or 40, I don't know. He later stated that he had killed between 50 and 70 boys. However, the police were able to identify only 27 victims killed between 1923 and 1924. Haarmann was charged with the murders and a trial date was soon set. During the trial, Haarmann smoked cigarettes and insulted everyone present. One day, looking at a photograph of a missing boy, he shouted to a grieving father that he could not be his relative because he was too ugly. Haarmann's lover, Granz, who often blackmailed him into killing specific children, was sentenced to life in prison, but the sentence was later commuted to 12 years. After the execution, Haarmann's head was placed in formaldehyde and given to the medical school in Göttingen. In 1925, the remains of his victims, found in the River Leine, were buried in a mass grave at the Steckener Cemetery. And although the people of Hanover sought to forget about the terrible crimes of Haarmann, they inspired the director Fritz Lang to create the classic thriller M, which was released in 1931. In the film, the police and criminals of a large German city are on the hunt for a serial killer who kills children. However, the terrible crimes of Haarmann had another unpredictable effect. And although homosexuality was banned in Germany at that time, it was tolerated for several years. After the terrible stories about Haarmann and Granz, a wave of homophobia swept the country. As most Germans became hardened towards gays, this paved the way for the subsequent Nazi killing campaign against homosexuals. Hans Granz lived to a ripe old age and died in Hanover in 1975. Decades later, in 2015, the medical school in Göttingen, tired of keeping Haarmann's canned head, cremated it, thus destroying the last traces of the Hanoverian butcher. This is where our video ends. Friends, I will be very grateful if you just like, write a comment and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being with us.